It was just supposed to be a fun excursion. Pete and I were going to break into that old house on the corner, the one that's been abandoned for so long, and do a little drinking and see what it led to. Pete and I have been dating for a couple of months now, but given where we live, we had to keep it a secret. 2 boys canoodling in the back of someone's car was still grounds for town scandal, and neither of my parents, and certainly neither of his, would have understood any of it. Sometimes it felt like Pete was the only person in those days that understood me, and I was pretty glad for him. Without Pete, I would probably not have made it to adulthood. The house we were going to break into didn't have a fancy name or some kind of weird history. It was a 3-story house on an acre and a half of land that was set in the dead center of the cul-de-sac. It had sat there for as long as anyone could remember. It had an attic, it was supposed to have a basement, and nobody could remember who had built it or why it was abandoned. Sometimes people bought it and tried to fix it up, but they always left and claimed the house was haunted. Sometimes people rented it, but they never stayed for long. They always left too, and most of them said they could hear things in there that they didn't have an answer for. Whatever it was, it had been abandoned for a long time, but it never seemed to fall down. Despite the fact that no one ever lived in it, it always seemed to look exactly the same as it always had. The paint was eggshell white that was going towards dusty brown, and it always seemed just about ready for a new paint job. The railing was always in danger of falling off. The grass was always in need of a cut, but not enough to make it past ankle height. The windows always looked dusty. The door always looked slightly ajar. But it was an old house, and that wasn't uncommon. It was mostly a neighborhood curiosity, the kind of place that 100 different ghost stories are told about, but none of them are true. It's a place where teenagers went to smoke and drink and do all sorts of other things. Pete and I made it there just as the sun was setting. I had brought a 6-pack from my dad's outside fridge, something he wouldn't miss until he ran out, and Pete had brought a boombox and a lantern. He had also brought a blanket and some snacks, and we were more than prepared to hang out and listen to some music and just be with each other. We hadn't done much more than a little bit of kissing, but you never knew when the mood might take us. To my surprise, the front door was unlocked. I'm not saying that we lived in a rough neighborhood, but most people still kept their doors locked at night. Despite the house being abandoned, I assumed they were trying to sell it. It would be difficult to do if they were squatters living in it, and Pete broke out his lantern as we checked the house for homeless people. We didn't see any, and there was none of the usual leavings behind. Other than cobwebs and dust, we didn't find any beer bottles or food wrappers or old clothes that had been left behind in a hurry. We decided to go up to the attic to hang out, a spot that a lot of kids went to spend time together. The stairs creaked under us as we made our way up them, and it was easy to believe that we might be being watched by spirits. Everyone said the house was haunted, but no one had ever actually seen any ghosts here. We got to the 2nd floor and went looking for the staircase that was supposed to lead us to the 3rd floor. It was hard to imagine why anyone would need a house this large. No one we knew had more than 2 or 3 kids, and I counted at least 6 rooms on the 2nd floor. The 3rd floor had another 5, and it took a little bit of looking to find the door to the attic. Pete was almost a head taller than me, and he easily reached up and grabbed the pull ring as the stairs came down with a thump. "After you," he said, with a chivalrous bow. I thanked him and climbed up the staircase, with my boyfriend right behind me. The attic was where we found the first evidence that people had been there. There were sleeping bags and beer bottles, flashlights and garbage, and someone had begun carving initials in the central beam of the attic. We spread out our blanket, turned on the radio, and started drinking as we listened to music. Neither of us were experienced drinkers, and we both began to feel a little tipsy after the 2nd beer. A song came on that I liked, and we danced around a little bit as we let the alcohol waft over us. It was nice, A nice memory for a boy I would only know for another couple of years. A fond remembrance of a time before everything got so hectic. As I lay my head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, I opened my eyes when I heard something from the floor below. I tried to close my eyes and pretend I hadn't heard it, but when it came again, it became less of an idea and more of an actuality. "Do you hear that?" I asked, as I looked up at Pete. Pete looked down at me as if he'd been hoping that he was hearing things. "Yeah. What did it sound like to you?" It sounded like someone knocking," I told him dubiously. "Good, because that's what it sounded like to me, too." We turned off the music and just stood there for a moment, listening for the sounds again. We felt a little silly as we stood stock still in the light of his lantern, and as the moments stretched on, I started to laugh a little at myself. It had all been nerves. There had been no knocking, there had been no sound. We had just expected to be found here, and so we had concocted it. We expected the whole town to come up to the attic and find a couple of boys doing something unnatural up here. It was all just nerves and fear and a dozen other things that I was still too young to explain to myself. I was about to suggest that we turn the radio back on when I heard the noise again. This time I was sure we both heard it. 3 loud knocks from somewhere inside the house. "What do you think it is?" Pete asked. "Only one way to find out," I told him, and grabbed up the lantern and headed for the stairs. "Come on, I don't want to go down there if there's somebody here. Let's just wait and see if they come up to the attic. If they do, maybe we can sneak out while they're, doing whatever it is they're doing." "Don't be a scaredy cat, Pete. It's probably just a rat or something. Or a bird that's gotten into the house. It's bumping against the wall. Let's go investigate. It'll be fun." Pete looked as if it was the furthest thing from fun that he had ever imagined, but he came along behind me as if not wanting to be undone by his much smaller and much less manly boyfriend. The two of us came out of the attic and looked around the 3rd floor. It was just as empty as it had been when we came up, but I thought I heard the knocking again from somewhere lower in the house. It was definitely from the ground floor. That much I was sure of, and I told Pete that we needed to go a little lower if we wanted to find the source of the knocking. He nodded, looking for all the world like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo as his knees knocked and his voice cracked a little. It was cute, in a dopey sort of way. We went to the 2nd floor, and that's when the knocking got closer. There were 6 doors leading from one staircase to the next, and I'd lifted my lantern to see if I could find where the knocking was coming from when the door to my left suddenly rattled as if someone was knocking from the other side. I looked at Pete and just shrugged. We assumed it was one of our friends playing a joke. Maybe they had followed us here so that they could have some of our beer, and I grabbed the knob and threw the door open, suddenly hoping to startle one of them. I expected to see Davy or maybe Hank, but to my surprise, the room was empty. There was nothing inside but cobwebs and old furniture. No one was hiding. No one was standing there with their fist raised as if they'd been caught. And one look at the floor told me that anyone hiding would have been given away pretty quickly. The floor was caked with dust, and at that time the dust was undisturbed. I was still looking at the door when I heard another door knock a little way down. It would have been the room next to the one that I was in, and I looked up in time to see it bounce in its frame as the last hit landed on the wooden surface. "Do you think it's a ghost?" Pete asked. "No clue. Come on, let's check it out." No sooner had we opened that door and found another empty room than another knock came from the next door down. We kept following the knocking, each door rattling as we came to the next one, and eventually we got back to the stairs. No sooner had we looked down into the dark mouth that would carry us to the ground floor than the knocking picked up down there. Pete looked like he was getting scared, He was never a big fan of scary stuff, despite being a pretty big guy, but I was curious now, and I really wanted to see what was going on. He followed me downstairs, though. I got the feeling he would have rather run out the front door than gone deeper into the house, though. I looked at the front door, expecting the knocking to come from there next, but instead, the knocking came from deeper in the house. I went a little further and discovered it was coming from a door that led to the dining room. Inside it was a very old kitchen table, the kind that was laid out with a lacy tablecloth that was covered in cobwebs and dust, which made it look even more like something from a haunted house. There were candle holders on the table that were equally as covered, and the chairs had all been pushed in as if they were just expecting dinner guests to arrive. There were still pictures on the wall, even an ancient grandfather clock that sat in the corner and moved not at all. The whole place looked as if someone had lived there just yesterday and hadn't been there for over 100 years. I was admiring one of the pictures when I heard a knock come from the door on the other side of the room. It had to be the kitchen, and when I pushed it open, I found a very large kitchen fit for a handful of servants. The stove, the fridge, the island that sat in the middle, everything was covered in dust and looked as if it had never been used. Some of the decor was in the process of being remodeled, and a few of the cabinets were sitting naked as if someone had been hanging doors on them and just decided it was time to leave. Pete went and opened the fridge, looking surprised when the light didn't come on, but he jumped when another knock came from the door not too far to his left. I would have bet my six-pack that the door led to the basement, and as I opened it, I was rewarded with a dark set of steps that led down into the guts of the house. I had taken a step onto the stairs when Pete put a hand on my shoulder, and I looked back to find him shaking his head. Let's just go back up to the attic. We can ignore it and do whatever you want. I don't want to go into the basement. I don't know what's going on down there, and I don't know what's making that knocking sound. But I'm scared, and I really don't want to find out. I did something I would feel bad about later. I would think back on it years later and realize that he had been terrified, and that I had decided my curiosity gave me the right to be cruel. I looked back at him and told him he was being a baby, and to just come on so we could figure out what was going on. He looked at me like I'd slapped him, like I'd just told him that I hated him. But when I took a step onto the stairs, he didn't stop me this time. He went down into the bowels of the house, and what we found was something a little different than a door. What we found was a huge basement that still had shelves full of things from previous families. Boxes of pictures, old snorkels and inner tubes. We saw sleds and bags of clothes, an ancient washing machine, a shelf full of preserved fruits and vegetables that no one would ever eat, and a huge metal door set into the very middle of the basement. It was set into a wall that looked like someone had ripped it out of a cave. 4 walls of uncut stone, looking raw as if they'd been ejected from the earth themselves. I held the lantern up to have a look at it, and as I did, I heard a loud banging from the front of it. That was where the knocking had been coming from. This was the source of all the noise. I took a step forward, wanting to open it and find out what all this was about, but Pete had suddenly had enough. I jumped when he screamed, a high scream like a cat that had been stepped on, and he ran up the stairs and out of the house like the devil was chasing after him. I took one more look at the door, but I was already going after him before I could stop myself. He went right out the front door and went running down the street, still screaming and lifting his legs in a comical way. I told him to keep it down, told him that people would see us, but he didn't care. He just kept running, and he didn't stop till he was almost a mile from the house. I asked him several times what he had seen that had made him so afraid, but no matter when I asked, he would never tell me. He refused to go back to that house ever again, and I wasn't quite brave enough to go by myself. I think that was the end of our relationship. I was mad at him for stealing the opportunity from me, and we just drifted apart after that. We stayed together for another 1.5 years, as much as we could ever be together, but when he told me that he had gotten a football scholarship to go to LSU, he also told me that it was too far away for a long-distance relationship. He told me he would miss me. I told him I'd also miss him. A couple of years later, and I barely remember him, but I always remember that house. It's become something of an obsession. I never went back. I wasn't quite that brave, but I did do some research on the house. People have definitely gone missing in the Knocking house. Kids mostly, but the occasional drifter as well. No one ever investigates any of it. The kids are all considered runaways, and the homeless people usually fall into the category of they shouldn't have been there in the first place. The house has never eaten a family, but they all mostly decide it's too weird to stay. They pick up roots and leave, and the house just seems to stay abandoned. It never gets any older, never gets any better, and it always remains. I still dream about whatever was in the basement. I wonder sometimes what could be behind that door, but I still can't quite find the courage to go find out. I spent 8 years in college getting my doctorate in things that most people would call rocket science, I guess. I study string theory and black holes and all that, but I think all of it's been in service to understanding what happens inside that house. Did the people the house disappeared really just vanish, or did they go somewhere else? Is the house a regular house, or is it possibly a way station for things going somewhere else? I don't know, and unless I can find a backbone, I guess I never will. Every time I remember that afternoon, when I was much younger and much more naive, it makes me want to go back. Whenever I remember the way Pete screamed when he saw whatever it was in the basement, I know I never will. Come on, man, just come out for a little bit. Harry, you know I don't drink. It doesn't mean you can't come out and have a good time. I hear Debbie's gonna be there. I know she's got a crush on you. Yeah, but I'm just not feeling very well. I think I might stay in tonight. Don't give me that crap. You stay in most every night. Just come out with us and have fun. Just for a little bit. You don't have to stay all night, and you don't have to drink, but we are your friends, so come out and have a good time. I growled as I shifted the phone to my other ear. Harry was really laying it on thick tonight. Okay, but just for a little while. I've got an early day tomorrow. All right. Maybe we can even get a little booze in you for a change. I'll see you at the lounge then. 7:30. Don't be late. I told him I wouldn't and hung up the phone. I turned to the mirror and saw it hovering over my shoulder. I looked away before I could make eye contact with it. You couldn't hear what it had to say if you didn't make eye contact. That was a lesson I had learned a long time ago. I'm not opposed to going out and having some fun. I like my friends, and I like hanging out with them, but the problem is that I know a little more than I should. I can see a little more than most people, and it makes having friends and being in relationships very difficult. Some would say almost impossible, but I've managed to stay with Harry and his group of friends longer than most. Harry's problem is that he likes to drink, and that's where most of my problems come from. Ever since I was little, I've had this strange kind of sight. It's the kind of thing you don't realize until you see it, and it never seems to go away, no matter what I do. I think it started with my father, as most of my problems do. My mother had spirits too, but hers were quieter than most. They were these drab little phantoms, little more than wisps, that whispered about how unhappy she was. Mom was such a bright woman that it never made a lot of sense for her spirits to be so unhappy. My father, on the other hand, was mostly intoxicated. He worked at the docks during the day, doing manual labor, and when he got home, it was after stopping at the bar or stopping to get a six-pack on the way home. The six-packs became 12-packs, and pretty soon he was coming home drunk so that he could drink some more. Mom never seemed to mind. She always just tried to make the best of it. But Dad would he'd get so angry sometimes that there really wasn't any way to ignore it. He broke my arm when I was about 5. Just grabbed me up after I reached for something. The worst part were the spirits that hung around him and the secrets that they would whisper. I hate my family. I should have never stayed. I should just disappear. Sometimes I think about killing them. Dad was how I figured out about my strange ability, and it's something I don't talk about very often with people. I can see the spirits that hang around people after they've been drinking. Some people have more ghosts than others, but every time you consume alcohol, it adds a spirit to your menagerie. Harry has thousands of them, a regular cloud of ghosts that hover around him and seem to take up almost everything else. It makes it hard to concentrate on conversations or games or whatever it is we're doing. But the real problem is eye contact. Like I said, anytime you make eye contact with them, they tell you a secret about the person. That's how I know that Harry ran over his dog when he was 16 and blamed it on his older brother. That's how I know that Harry used to steal money from his mom when she was asleep. That's how I know that Harry got a girl pregnant and left her and the kid in a different town before coming to live in ours. It's hard knowing these things, and the more people that are around, the more likely you are to learn something really terrible. Take Harry's friend, Denny. Denny is a nice enough guy. He's clean cut, he has a pretty good job, he owns a car, he's married with kids, and he seems pretty well put together. The problem is that Denny also has a lot of spirits that hover around him. That's how I learned that Denny likes to perform vivisections on animals while they're still alive in his basement. That's how I learned that he sometimes steals people's mail and packages. That's how I learned that he was running an identity fraud scheme over quite a few different victims. That's how I learned that Denny smothered his younger brother when they were still kids. People look like they're put together, but when you can see their secrets, it really changes them in your eyes. I got ready, as little as I wanted to, and met Harry and his friends at the bar about 5 minutes early. I didn't rendezvous with them at first. I had to psych myself out in order to make it through the bar. Bars are the worst. Everyone's drinking, everyone's having a good time, and it's like stepping through a forest of broken glass in order to find what you're looking for. Their secrets bombard you like bees, and sometimes I have to close my eyes and just hope I don't bump into anybody. She doesn't love him. He sometimes beats up prostitutes. It's not his kid and he knows it. He hit a man on the way home one night and never went back to check on him. He killed 13 people, and he's looking for number 14 tonight. Hey, you finally made it. Harry came up and threw an arm around me, already reeking of alcohol. I tried not to notice, like I always do. Denny was already there, as was Debbie, and Harry's other 2 friends, Reggie and Mark. The table was a little crowded with all the spirits hanging around them, and it made me feel claustrophobic, as it always does. Hey, you, Debbie said, as she gave me a smile and waved at me. I waved back, trying to be polite, but it's hard when I could hear her own spirits whispering her secrets. She had put her mother in a subpar nursing home, after the dementia had made her nearly catatonic. She kept having abortions, not out of practicality, but because it was something she enjoyed doing for some reason. She would stay with men, sometimes just to have a safe place to live for a while, which wasn't so bad until you also heard that she would steal from them before finally leaving them. She had stolen medication from a relative once, her great aunt, and when the woman had died because she couldn't get it, she'd felt bad, but she hadn't told anyone. These were the heavy ones, but they weren't all that she had either. "Are you okay? I always forget how much crowds weird you out. You always look like you're about to start running," she said, which elicited a laugh from everyone else. Harry and Debbie were awfully chummy tonight, and I could hear her spirits talking about how she had intended to stay with him for a while so that she could swindle a little more money before she moved on. Harry had pretty terrible taste in friends, and I certainly wasn't immune to that. All of his friends seemed to need money or need things, and Harry was just too nice a guy to tell any of them no. They'd bleed him dry and then probably leave him with nothing, but Harry never complained about it. He was glad to help people. That was probably why he was still hanging out with me. It was the reason that I kept agreeing to things like this. Sometimes I liked to make sure that Harry didn't get in over his head. Sometimes I liked to keep an eye on him and make sure that he had a safe place to land when the smoke cleared. He would do the same for me. I knew he would, but being in Harry's house was like being under constant bombardment. It would mean constantly being with his demons, and I just couldn't do it. If that makes me weak or selfish, then I'm sorry, but I just can't live that way. I sat and listened to them, listened to the spirits, and listened to my friends, and tried to block out the chorus of angry ghosts hanging around the patrons. It was like sitting in a high school cafeteria and trying to listen to one specific conversation. It was nearly impossible to do, and the longer you tried, the more crazy it made you feel. It was maddening, listening to all those voices raised at once. And when I finally got up and told them I needed to go to the bathroom, they laughed and said it was probably about time for me to head out anyway. They were right, but I couldn't head out until I had bolstered up enough courage to walk back out of the room. The trip to the bathroom was bad enough. He cheated on his wife. She's married to 3 men. She has an STD. He has cancer and refuses to do anything about it. The ghosts screamed at me as I ran to the bathroom, and only when the door was locked behind me, I finally felt like I could breathe easy. This was why I never went out. This was why I never interacted with anyone. This is why I usually don't have friends. There's only so long I can take it until I feel like I'm going to go insane, and it takes me a couple of days of staying inside before I'm able to interact again. I went to the basin to wash my face, and that's when I looked up and saw the one hateful spirit moving around my own head. He was old, a spirit I'd had since I was a kid, but his voice was just as sneaky and clawing as it had always been. "You killed him. You killed him and you liked it." He was right. Of course he was right. The ghosts are always right. I was 17 when I came home from a chess club meeting and found my father beating my mother in a drunken rage. He had hit her before. He'd hit me too, but this wasn't just slapping her around and then falling back into his armchair for another drink. He was towering over her as she sat huddled on the floor. He was raining down blow after blow as she covered her face and begged him to stop. Her nose was smashed flat against her cheek. Her eye looked like raw meat after so many beatings. And he never even heard me when I came inside. He was yelling about something, probably dinner being burnt or her getting a phone call from someone, but it didn't matter. Something inside me snapped, and I realized I'd had as much of this as I was going to take. I grabbed up Mom's cast iron skillet from the stove, and that's when he heard me. He turned mid-punch and grinned at me with what he must have thought was a terrifying look. His eyes told me that he knew I wouldn't swing it. His eyes told me that he knew I didn't have the guts to do anything about it. His eyes told me that he expected me to drop the pan and say I was sorry and take my own section of a beating from him. But on that day, he was wrong. I brought the pan down across his face, and it broke his cheekbone and his nose in one swipe. I thought about stopping at that, but I didn't. He started to slur something at me, probably something hateful, but I hit him again in the side of the head, and he went down in a heap. I hit him 5 more times, each one wetter than the last, and when I finally stopped, I started to cry. I realized what I had done. I knew I had killed him, but I cried because I felt so righteous about it. I'd enjoyed killing him. I'd enjoyed killing this man that had tormented me every day since I was old enough to understand. He had needed to go, and I had taken him out. Mom helped me bury him under the house. I remember going into the crawl space and digging a hole, and the two of us putting him in there and covering him with lime and concrete. We had covered the concrete with more dirt, and both of us had swore never to speak of it again. That night was the first and only time I had ever had a drink. The bottle was just sitting there on the kitchen counter, a bottle of whiskey that Dad had probably meant to drink that night. I looked at it as I sat at the kitchen table and tried to make sense of what I had done, and suddenly I was just so damn thirsty. I was thirsty for something that would make me forget what I had done, and I poured a glass and took a sip before I could stop myself. It tasted like fire. It burned my mouth. It burned my throat. It made me cough as it slid into my stomach. It felt like I was gonna throw up, but as I ran to the bathroom in case I needed to vomit, that's when I saw that I had a ghost of my own. It was the same spirit that I would keep for the rest of my life. And when I looked up, it told me that I had killed my father, and I liked it. I started screaming loud enough that my neighbors called the police. I told them I thought someone was checking around the back door, that it had scared me pretty badly, but even as the officer with the sunglasses took my report, I could see the ghost reflected back in them as he stared at me. He was staring at me now as I splashed water on my face at the sink, same way he always did. I was no better than the rest of them, but I'd still managed to stop at one drink. I swore I would never have another, but sometimes I wonder if it might be easier to handle the spirits if I was drunk. I remind myself that they'll only grow more frequent if I do, and eventually I'll crawl into some bottle, probably the same one that killed my father, and never come back out. It's important to remember that the spirits you consume have ghosts of their own, and to pray that you don't have to see them the way that I do. I've been working on boats for most of my life. It's a good trade. I've worked on fishing boats, merchant boats, even worked on some Navy vessels during the late 80s and early 90s. I've been on boats so small they could barely hold a cooler of fish, and boats so large that they seemed to take up more ocean than the fish did. I love the water. I love being out on the water. It's always been a passion of mine, and I think I was always destined to find myself out on the ocean. That's a destiny I've come to question after what happened during my last voyage. I work for a shipping company that goes all across the world, and I've done everything from clean cabins to steer massive barges. These days, the computers do most of the steering, but there still has to be somebody in the wheelhouse to make sure they're going in the right direction. After so long on the water and so much experience, that's where I find myself more often than not these days. The company I work for has a lot of respect for a man of my experience, and most of the time they let me pick my own crew. I know most of them in the area who work on the boats, and a lot of them are more than happy to sail out with me. It's not a bad life. You sail out for 3 to 6 months, you come back with a fat paycheck, you spend a couple of months on land, and then you go back out and do it again. I've seen some great wonders out on the ocean. Pods of dolphins that seem to be miles long. I've seen sperm whales breach and killer whales in groups long enough to make me wonder if they were hunting my boat. I've been in places where the water just seems to go dead. I've stood on the foredeck and looked at the water that the wind refuses to touch. And I've stood out there at night and seen strange shadows under the waves reflected by the moonlight. I've seen some bad things too, but the good always seems to outnumber them. I've come across vessels that have been hit by pirates or just people looking to hurt others. I've seen animals killed and just left out in the water. Like I said, most of the time, the good outweighs the bad, but there are definitely some strange things out there that don't look at us the same way we look at them. One of the strangest I remember was when I was working on a Navy vessel out near the coast of Africa. I was out on the deck one night, smoking and talking with some friends, and that's when I saw something ghostly come gliding out of the fog near the spot we had anchored. I remembered thinking the spot had probably made a pretty great place for privateers to dock once upon a time. It would have made a good place to put down your anchor and row your cargo in if you didn't want your custom looked over for valuables. None of the people I was there with claimed that they had seen it, but sure as God's got sandals, I saw a galleon of at least 40 men come gliding out of that dark and head straight for a port no more than about 10 miles from the ship. They were talking about something and not paying attention, but I couldn't take my eyes off that ghostly ship for anything. I kept thinking it was going to crash into the port, and you could see the men moving around on the deck. They were dressed in old clothes, the kind of thing that made you think they might be pretending to be pirates. And when my cigarette burned down between my fingers, I hissed and dropped it over the side as I shook my hand. I looked back up, expecting to see that the boat had run into the dock and broken into pieces, but it was just gone. I asked my friends if they'd seen it, but they all just shook their heads and said I might have been at sea a little too long. They laughed, but I knew what I had seen. What I saw a couple of weeks ago was even worse than that, and I'm just not sure it's something I can ever put behind me. I've been sailing the ocean for about 40 years now, but that's something I just can't come to terms with. We were heading towards northern Canada, coming up from Florida with a whole barge of stuff. We had about 500 of those metal containers that make up most of your cargo when you go to port these days. It's all about stuffing as much as you can in them and putting as many of those containers on the ship as humanly possible. I suppose it's economical, but if you hit a bad storm, a lot of those containers end up in the water. There's just nothing you can do about it, and they're too heavy to pull up if the weather is especially bad. We'd been sailing for about 3 days when we got hit by a pretty bad storm. The waves and the rain would have capsized anything smaller than my barge, but the old girl was rolling along pretty well. Our containers were lashed down pretty tight, and I was proud of myself for not having lost one of them. A storm like this would usually claim at least a dozen or more, but everything was as secure as I could make it, and I was sitting in the wheelhouse as my men huddled below deck. There wasn't an actual wheel in the wheelhouse anymore. It's all slides and computers and automatic systems now, but it does give you a pretty good idea of what's going on since it's around the highest point of the ship, if you don't count the rigging. I was strapped in since the waves were really making it feel like I was on a roller coaster, and that's when I began to feel something was watching me. It was a tickle on my left cheek, and I started to scratch at my skin like there might be bugs there. It happened every time the lightning flashed outside, because you weren't seeing much else out there without it. It was night out on the ocean, and everything was pretty dark out there. The lights on the ship were barely making it through the rain, and sometimes I thought it was beautiful, all that impregnable darkness out there. You just never knew what was waiting out there in the blue. But today it was terrifying. If you went overboard tonight, there would be no saving you. If you went over tonight, no one would even realize you had fallen until you weren't in your bunk in the morning. I felt it again as the next lightning strike came, and when I glanced to my left, I would have fallen out of my seat if it hadn't been for the straps that were holding me in. Like I said, the water at night's pretty dark without a moon to show you anything out there. Tonight, the clouds were so thick that I could barely see the sky for the rain. There was no moon out there to light anything up, but the lightning was doing a pretty good job of it. It would arc down into the water, lighting the whole thing for about 3 to 5 seconds. And in those seconds, I'd seen something not far from the ship. It was huge, at least 20 feet tall, and that was what I could see of it coming out of the water. I thought it might be an iceberg or some kind of floating debris, but just as I began to see it, the sky darkened, and I was left with nothing but the rain-spattered glass. I turned back to the instruments, wanting to make sure we were still on course. But about 10 seconds later, another bolt of lightning split the sky. I turned, and that's when I got a better look at it. It was a hulking shape, vaguely human-shaped, but covered in writhing appendages of some sort. It was hard to tell. It was still dark out there, but as I stared at it, I could see it was even bigger than I had thought it was. It was easily 30 feet high, and as the sky went black again, I found myself staring at the spot with growing dread. I clenched the sides of my chair, waiting for another lightning strike, and didn't have long to wait. Boom! The sky lit up again. The thing was easily a mile from the boat, but it had gotten even bigger since I'd seen it. I don't know if it was surfacing or if it was just growing in size as it came toward me, but whatever the case, it was getting bigger and closer. Its body was a solid mass of darkness, and I was sure I could see things wriggling on it. It looked like a statue as it stood out of the water, and I could easily see a torso and the start of a waist. Nothing should have been able to stand out there. It would have had to have been even bigger than it looked, but as the sky went dark again, I didn't dare look away from it. I waited as the rain spattered against the glass, just waiting to see where it would be when the sky erupted again. 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, and then suddenly the lightning came again, and I looked quickly as I tried to see what it was. It was even closer now, and every lightning flash made it larger than the last time I had seen it. It was nearly 3 stories tall now, and it was less than a mile from the boat and gaining on us. It wasn't covered in tentacles like I'd thought. It was covered in sea life. Whatever it was, it had clearly come from somewhere very deep. Its body was awash with squid and barnacles and other such things that one might find way down deep in the water. Some of them were flailing, falling off, but some of them were just clinging for dear life, as if hoping that whatever this was would submerge again soon. I still couldn't tell much about it. It was covered in kelp and mud and something even darker that seemed to be dripping off of it. What I could see was a trio of red, angry eyes that sat under a ridge of kelp on its head. I couldn't see its face, but those eyes bore into me as if I was an intruder that needed to be killed immediately. As the sky darkened, I turned back to the ship's controls. I pushed up the speed as much as I dared, not wanting to flood the engine the next time we hit a particularly big wave. It couldn't go a lot faster anyway. We were already cruising along pretty quick, but I knew we weren't going to be fast enough to outrun whatever this was. It was eating up the ocean as it came toward us, and I didn't want to know what would happen when it got close enough to take a swipe at us. The lightning came again, and I turned my head without really wanting to. It was about 100 feet from us. There was less distance between it and us than the entire ship took up. It was still making its way toward us, the waves from its movement hitting us out of sync with the rest of the storm surge. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what I could do, but I knew that I had to protect the men on board. Their lives were in my hands, and if this thing sank the boat, we'd lose more than the cargo. The sky darkened, and I couldn't take my eyes off the glass, as I imagined I could feel the vibrations of this thing getting closer to us. There was no way it could be that far out of the water. We were in open water. The sea floor was miles and miles beneath us. Nothing like this could come that far out of the water and still have its feet on the ground. Despite this, it was hard not to imagine I could feel the tremors through the water as this thing moved closer and closer. What would it be like to have my ship suddenly sliced in half by an arm the size of a skyscraper? What would it be like to have this creature put a foot through the hull and then scoop us up as we sank? Would it eat us, or just be content to watch us drown? I waited for the lightning flash, not even sure that I wanted to see, and when it came, I was rewarded with the most horrifying thing of all. The lightning flashed, but all I saw was nothing. Just open ocean, storm-tossed waves, and nothing but my own vessel out on the raging water. I kept looking, kept staring, but it never came back. After a while, I began to wonder if I'd fallen asleep and dreamed it, but there was no way I could have fallen asleep out here. The water was too rough. In the last 30 minutes, I'd nearly been smashed against the console, despite the restraints that held me in the chair. The way the ship was bucking, there was no way I could have nodded off for even a moment. Had I been hallucinating? Had I been awake too long? I didn't know. But whatever that creature was, he still haunts my dreams. Every night after that, I've been back in that wheelhouse and waiting as the lightning flashed and the beast got closer and closer. In my dreams, I don't get a view of the empty ocean as it slipped back beneath the waves. In my dreams, I'm face to face with those 3 blood-red eyes, and then the creature simply pulls us into its giant mouth. I've been back on land for months, and I just don't know if I can ever go back to the sea. Who's to say such a creature won't be out there waiting when we ship out? Who's to say what might be out there that's even worse? I run a bait shop out of the large shed in my side yard. It's easier than trying to buy a place in town where you have to pay all these taxes and get all these permits. The town I live in is technically unincorporated, so all I have to do is pay for a single permit to operate a business out of my home. It's great. I'm the only employee. Most of my business is done with a Ring doorbell camera. I put it on the door, and when customers come up, they ring the bell, and I come out to get them what they want. I sell worms and crickets, night crawlers and minnows, all kinds of mealworms and fly larvae, and anything else you might need if you're going fishing or taking care of an exotic pet. The business isn't stellar in the area. I only make a couple of $1,000s a week off wigglers and crickets, but it's decent money for a guy who's retired and really doesn't have a lot of bills. At least until last night. Like I said, I've got a doorbell cam set up on the shop, so when people come up to buy things, they ring the bell, and I come out to deal with them. The hours for the bait shop are posted on the door as being from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. I don't go out after dark, and I'm not coming to get you worms before dawn, not unless you call ahead the day before. Some people try. I've certainly had to explain to some people why I'm not coming out to give them bait at 11:30 at night. Most people understand, but there have definitely been some heated discussions over that Ring doorbell camera. Doesn't matter to me. I own a gun, and I got a pretty thick front door, so if you want to make a big deal out of it, then we can make a big deal. The general response time out here for law enforcement is 10 to 20 minutes, so most people are their own security system. Last night at about midnight, somebody pressed the Ring doorbell camera, and it brought me up out of a dead sleep. I'm an older guy, and I tend to be in bed by 9 o'clock. I'd left the TV on, something that would play in the background, so it would feel like I wasn't living by myself. And when I snorted up out of sleep, I thought maybe it had been something on the show I was watching. Matlock was on, and the old detective was yelling at a couple of kids who had done something stupid. I started to go back to bed before I heard the chime on my phone a second time. That definitely meant something was going on the app, and I picked it up and saw that someone had engaged it at 12 o'clock midnight, and then again at 12:01. The chances of somebody coming to my place that late are pretty slim, but like I said, it does happen sometimes. I started to ignore it, thinking it was just a fluke, but then the chime came again, and I realized that whoever it was might be legitimate. Bait shop hours are from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m., I said into the phone, a little more gravelly than I meant to. If you're trying to get bait, come back during business hours. I set the phone down and started getting comfy again when the chime came again. 12:04 a.m., and someone had hit the button a third time. Hey, buddy, it's after midnight. I don't sell anything after 7 p.m. If you want to buy bait, you're going to have to wait till tomorrow. I stared at the phone as if expecting something to happen. And when they pressed the button again, I started getting mad. I had posted hours for a reason. If you don't post hours, then these idiots would just stop by anytime they felt like it and expect you to sell them bait. I've had people like that in the beginning. People that thought I would come out at all hours of the night to serve them. I'd done it at first, walking out in the pitch black to scoop them up some crickets or some night crawlers. But I'd stepped down in a gopher hole a few months ago and nearly broke my ankle. That had been it for me, and that's when I had posted the business hours, and I hadn't stomped out there after dark since. If this fellow wanted to persist, then he wasn't getting anything, and I'd be happy to tell him not to bother coming back during business hours either. At 12:08, he hit the button again, and I started getting pissed. Get the hell away from my shop. I'm not coming out there in the middle of the night to serve you anything. Go away and come back tomorrow. I hit the button so that I could hear what was going on out there, thinking it might be kids playing jokes or something. Sometimes the kids down the road thought it was funny to come by and trigger my camera. They would push the button and run off, usually amidst a gale of giggles. And if this was them, then I was going to talk to someone's parents tomorrow. Tommy Morris, if that's you and your little friends, I'm going to tell your father, and I'm going to get him to tan your hide, I shouted for good measure. To my surprise, I did not hear the usual sounds of laughter or the scramble of feet. I heard the typical night sounds, crickets and cicadas, and the strange sound of life going on outside my shed. There was another noise as well, a noise I couldn't place. It was an oddly wet sound, like listening to mud slosh around in a pail. Sounded like someone had made a snowman out of mud, and it was slowly falling apart outside my Ring camera. I've never heard anything like that before. I couldn't honestly do the sound justice, and the longer I listened to it, the more I began to hear something else. It was low at first, sounding like a voice at the bottom of a well, but the longer I listened, the more sense it made. Worms, it squelched. Squelched is the closest I can come to describing what it sounded like. It was a gloopy, watery noise, and it did not sound altogether healthy. Oh, what? I asked, as I sat there in my bed in disbelief. Worms, it said again, and now I could hear the liquid as it bubbled from whatever lips were forming those words. I hovered my finger over the button that would show me a video of whatever was facing the camera, but I just didn't feel as if I had the strength to do it. If I were to see what was sitting out there, what was asking for worms in that strange watery voice, I might never go out to that shop again. I might, in fact, just pack it all in and never leave my house again. Just knowing that something like that was out there waiting for me would probably send me into a state from which I might never come out of. Even so, I felt my finger beginning to shake as it hovered over the button. In the end, I decided it was better not to know. I pressed the button to speak and prayed that my voice would be steady. No worms. We're fresh out. Come back tomorrow. Whatever the voice was coming out of seemed to sigh in understanding before it turned and left my front door. I thought about looking again, but I just wasn't brave enough. If I'd seen something out there, then I just knew that I'd never go back again. I didn't sleep much that night. I'm not sure I'll ever sleep again. What am I supposed to do? I told it to come back tomorrow. Stupid me. So now I have to wonder what'll happen tomorrow night when it comes back looking for worms. What if it comes back every night, just looking for worms? I don't think for a minute that it was human, but then what else could it be? I think I might just leave some worms out there after I close up tomorrow. Maybe if it finds my offering, it'll go away and not bother me. $3.50 worth of worms is a decent enough price for my peace of mind. And it's a deal I'll make any day. Nuh-uh, not yet. You gotta let it breathe, man. The party had only been going for about a half an hour, and Leonard had been positioned around the wine since the cork had come out. That was Leonard, though. He was usually the guy who brought wine and then rattled on about it. He always talked about the vintage, about the area in which it was made in, and a dozen other such things, but today he seemed to be harping on when to drink it. He'd been the second to arrive, only minutes behind me, and he had presented Janet with the bottle as if it were a wondrous gift. "Wow," Janet had said when he came in with the old bottle of wine. "It looks great, Leonard. What did you bring us today?" "It's a..." And then he rattled off a name in a language that I didn't understand, but it had been sealed in 1901 and was supposed to be pretty fancy. He took it out and pulled a corkscrew out of his pocket. Leonard had always been a little funny about his wine, and when he tapped the corkscrew on the bottle before working it into the cork, I didn't think much of it. This was just how Leonard was. Everything had to be done with as much flash and panache as possible. Janet had brought some wine glasses over from the kitchen, but when she reached for the bottle, Leonard had brushed her hand away and waggled a finger at her. "Nuh-uh-uh, not yet. It needs to breathe." Janet looked a little miffed, but she nodded and set the glasses down around the bottle. Now the party was in full swing, but Leonard was still hanging around the bottle as if afraid someone would steal it. He was like a fly around something particularly tasty, and he just kept landing and sampling as the night went on. I wanted to mingle. I also wanted to do a little dancing in the space that Janet had cleared out, but my eyes just kept going back to Leonard and his wine. It was a weird bottle of wine, to be sure. The bottle was dusty looking, the kind of thing you might find in someone's basement, and the label was in what I assumed was French, given that the name had sounded like something out of France. The glass was tinted green, making me think of old medicine bottles, and it was kind of unpleasant to look at, but that probably meant it would taste heavenly. He was sitting next to the bottle as I reached out for a glass, and he put a hand over the top as I pulled it toward me. "Not yet. You gotta let it breathe." I rolled my eyes, releasing the glass as I crossed my arms. "Okay, but for how long?" Leonard smiled and winked at me, which surprised me a little. "You can't rush these things. Takes as much time as it takes. You don't want to drink inferior wine, do you?" I rolled my eyes and told him that I guessed I didn't. I moved away to mingle with some of the other party guests. Janet pulled me over to talk to some of her work friends, and as soon as they let me float on, I saw Lisa and went to ask her how her summer abroad had been. Then I saw Dale and Thomas, and then it was Carter and his wife, but my mind just didn't seem to be fixed on any one conversation. No matter how much I talked, I kept thinking about that wine. They invited me over to play Cards Against Humanity, but I felt like my plays were a little bit stilted as my eyes kept trailing back to the damn wine. I needed to taste it. I needed to know what all the fuss was about. The longer I looked and the longer I lingered, the more I just needed to know. That's the best I can explain it. It had become like a mania in me to know what exactly Leonard was gatekeeping there. As I watched, I began to wonder if the wine was okay for consumption. Leonard had said that it needed to breathe, and the more I watched it, the more it did appear to breathe. It drew in these slow breaths. At least that's how it looked to me. The glass seemed to be pulling itself in and out, and Leonard's smile seemed to widen every time he noticed. We always used the term, "let the wine breathe," but I'd never actually thought about it. The wine didn't usually breathe, not the way we did, but today it seemed to be doing just that. It seemed to be breathing hard enough that the bottle expanded a little with each exhalation. It looked small when Leonard had uncorked it, no bigger than a $5 bottle of Strawberry Hill or Blackberry Merlot from Walmart. But now it had almost grown to the size of something that you would pay an upwards of $20 for. I found that the more it expanded, the more I wanted it as well. It was like a siren song to me, and I noticed I wasn't alone. Leonard had put more than a few people off the bottle, but all of them seemed to be looking at it with great expectation. No matter what we were doing, I noticed other people glancing back and licking their lips, clearly interested in having a taste just as much as I was. I began to plan how I would get there first. I wanted to drink until I was done, and the idea of sharing it with anyone suddenly made me feel very angry. "Hey," Janet said suddenly, startling me out of my thoughts. "Heck of a party, huh?" I nodded, my eyes straying back towards the bottle as I told her it sure was. Janet certainly was having a good time. Her cheeks were pinker than I ever remember seeing them, and she looked giggly. All around us, people appeared to be equally as flushed, and there was quite a lot of dancing and laughing, and other things happening. "You want to dance?" she asked, but I was distracted. I realized I'd been looking at the bottle again. Checking my watch, I saw that it had actually been breathing for close to 2 hours. It had to be ready by now. There was no way that he could keep me off of it much longer. "Hey," Janet asked as she snapped her fingers next to my ear. "Are you all right? I asked if you wanted to dance, and you seemed like you're kind of spacing out tonight." "Huh? Sure." Something was playing on the stereo, something I was familiar with, and as Janet and I went out to the dance floor, it got slow enough that we could sway together. Janet and I weren't exactly dating, but I got the feeling that she might like to. Janet and I had known each other since high school, but it wasn't until college that we had really begun to spend a lot of time together. We were friends, we had some classes most semester, but lately she had been inviting me over to just hang out, and a lot of it was spent pretty close on the couch or talking about old memories. I knew there were some feelings there. There were some feelings on my end as well, but this was the first time that we had ever really explored anything like that. I'd always just been her friend, the shoulder to cry on, but as she leaned her head against that shoulder, I started to think there might be more there. It brought me out of the weird fugue state that I'd been in, and I started to feel a little bit more like myself. "Great party," I said offhandedly, immediately kicking myself for the lame remark. "Thanks, though it seems like everyone's a little bit distracted. I don't know what it is. It almost feels like maybe Leonard oversold that wine a little bit, don't you think?" And as she said it, I saw her run her tongue over her lips. "Do you think he'll let people try it soon? I've been waiting all night, and if it's anything but delicious, I think he might have a riot on his hands." "It's got to be soon," I said, and my voice sounded a little husky, even to my own ears. "He can't keep watching it much longer." Does it seem like it's gotten bigger to you? I remember it being much smaller, but now it seems like it might actually serve everyone." I glanced over my shoulder and almost gasped. She was right. It had gotten a lot bigger. The bottle was now like something that might take 2 hands to lift. Everybody could get as much of it as they wanted, but I realized that it wouldn't last for long. The way he had been overselling it, everybody would want as much as they could drink, and I really didn't think it would be very long, maybe a couple of glasses, before someone took the bottle from him. I rubbed my eyes a little, not sure what I was seeing at first. The bottle had grown, yes, but something else had happened too. It was breathing again, the glass moving in and out like it was panting. There was also something coming from the neck of the bottle. I don't know if you'd call it smoke or maybe mist, but it was streaming out slowly and deliberately. Leonard was sitting beside the bottle with the biggest grin on his face I'd ever seen. My grandmother had often said that he looked like the cat that had gotten into the cream, and that's exactly what he looked like to me right now. "Hey, do you want to maybe get out of here for a minute?" I looked down at Janet and saw that she wasn't focused on the bottle. She was focused on me, her eyes looking almost the same way mine did as they tried to make sense of Leonard and his weird bottle. She was looking smokily at me, and clearly she'd been drinking something tonight. Her face was flushed, and she looked like she was considering something that might not be altogether healthy. I thought about that a moment longer, and my mind finally said, fuck it. I'd been drinking too. We could make bad decisions together, if that's what she wanted. "Sure," I said. "Where are we going?" "My room. I think there's something there I should have shown you a long time ago." I followed her, and it might be why I'm alive to tell you the story right now. I'll spare you the gory details, but We had about 20 minutes of what I would call the best time of my life. It was definitely worth the wait, and I hoped she agreed, though it's not like I could ask her now. We'd just finished, lying beside each other on her double bed, as the decor of her room looked down on us. Janet's room was an even separation between the woman she was becoming and the girl that she had been before she went to college. The walls were covered in band posters, colorful horses, and a smattering of movie posters as well. Some of them were movies I had even seen, movies we had seen together, and they seemed to be glowering down at me in the semi-darkness of her room. As we lay there, I began to notice a sound coming from the living room. It wasn't an unpleasant sound, more like what we were doing here, but it was growing in volume, and Janet picked her head up groggily as she noticed too. "I've got to tell them to keep it down. They're going to make my neighbors complain, and then the landlord's going to yell at me. If you're still here when I get back, though, maybe we'll consider trying that again." She kissed me on the forehead, and she opened the door to her bedroom and walked out. I heard the volume go up by about 10 decibels from the other room. I lay there for a few minutes, still basking in the afterglow. But when I heard someone scream, I got up and went to see what was going on. Outside, everything had changed. The bottle had begun to do more than smoke as it sat in the middle of the table, and there was an odd light erupting from the guts of it. People were lying on the floor, doing things that Janet and I had been doing not too long ago. There was a real orgy going on in there, and I saw that Janet had been pulled into a throng of people as they moved around her. Leonard was standing on the table now, looking as if he had done something amazing, and when he spoke, it was with all the confidence of a Midwestern snake oil salesman. "I told you all to be patient. I told you all to let it breathe, but some of you don't listen very well. You just had to have a taste, and now you'll see what comes of it. Behold, the spirit you were looking for." It was more than lights now. Strange phantoms were moving around the room amidst the light show, and when they touched people, it seemed to invigorate them even more. People were out of control, moving in tight clumps as they pressed against each other like amorous jackhammers. People had begun to bleed, people had begun to scream, and before anyone could notice me, I closed the door. I didn't know what was going on. I was honestly a little too drunk to process any of it, and as the screams got louder and louder, I put my hands over my ears and eyes and tried to block them out. It was like the scene out of Raiders of the Lost Ark. If I didn't acknowledge them, maybe they would leave me alone. I would be free to leave when they were done. I felt like a coward, but what else was there? There was no fighting that. It was either join or hide. It went on for quite a while, longer than my own bit of revelry had lasted. When my phone told me that it was approaching midnight, though, the sounds began to change. The sounds of lovemaking and conquest were replaced by screams of agony. People began to beg whatever this was to stop, and some of their cries were choked out prematurely. I got up and walked towards the door, but something stopped me before I could wrap my hand around the knob. Whatever was out there would take me as well. And right then, I just wanted to stay as far away from it as I could get. Then midnight struck, and all was suddenly silent, like a soundtrack turned off without warning. I didn't move. I didn't immediately get up, but eventually my curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door to Janet's room and looked out into a sea of corpses that looked as if they had been mummified. Whatever had happened to them, it had drained them dry. They were all stiff and unmoving, their empty eyes staring at the ceiling as their faces were poised in looks of unimaginable horror. Whatever they had seen before they died had really stuck with them, and I didn't know what else to do except get the hell out of there. I thought about calling the cops, but what would I tell them? I'd been at a party, and then suddenly everyone had just died. How would I explain what had happened to these people? And more importantly, how would I explain why I was still here and why nothing had happened to me? One thing I did notice before I left, and it's something that makes me wonder if Leonard had known what would happen from the start. What I assume was Leonard's corpse was lying beneath the table, the one he had been guarding all night. But the bottle was gone. Whatever Leonard had uncorked that night had been beyond his understanding as much as ours. But I guess in the end he had been right. It had needed to breathe, but maybe it had gotten a little too much air. Whatever the case, I think we had summoned a spirit that none of us was prepared for. I suppose the cops will come and talk to me tomorrow. I intend to tell them that I left the party early, and I don't intend to tell them anything about glowing bottles or spirits moving around the apartment. Best case scenario, they would think I was insane. Worst case scenario, they would assume I was involved and take me to jail. Either way, Janet's last party was one that will stick with me for a very long time. Whatever spirit was moving through us last night was a little too potent. I've been a food critic for a little while, probably about 5 years. It's a good job, but it does come with some hassles. Not everybody appreciates it when you tell them exactly what you think of their food. Some people get angry, and they try to call the paper and get you fired. Some people get upset, and they yell at you on the street. Honestly, it's thankless work. Nobody appreciates somebody willing to tell you where you should and shouldn't eat. But it's work that I enjoy. I've been hearing about XO for a while now. It's this strange pop-up restaurant that seems to move around. It's supposed to be equal parts diner and art installation. The food is supposed to be extremely experimental, and the reviews are kind of mixed. Some people love it. They say that it was an experience that they would never want to relive, but it had changed them so fundamentally that they were different people now. Some of them said the restaurant went too far, and the food was less experimental and more psychological horror show. I had received a ticket in the mail yesterday, a reservation, for 8 o'clock at XO. I talked to my editor about it, and he was completely on board with me going. He said that a review of the restaurant would be amazing for the paper, and that if I didn't go, he might just have to fire me. He was joking, at least I think he was, but there was no way I was going to pass up on a chance to eat at such an exclusive restaurant. I dressed as I always did for these kinds of things, white shirt and suit jacket, a pair of slacks with some comfortable shoes, and I took my notepad as I headed for the location on the reservation. As I said, the restaurant isn't really in any given place. It moves around, and it's very difficult to get a reservation for. Some people said they waited months to get a table, and when I put out on my blog that I was eating there last night, a lot of people chose to leave some pretty jealous comments. They said it must be nice to be a food critic and get to eat at all the trendy places. They said they hoped I had a bad time since they'd probably never get to eat there. They said a lot of things, but I ignored most of them. In my business, you get pretty good at ignoring people who just want to get under your skin. I arrived outside an old warehouse promptly at 8 o'clock, and there was a tall, bald guy with a clipboard checking off names. I showed him my reservation, and he looked me over critically. I guess people had tried to sell their reservations before, but he must have approved of what he saw because he opened the door and told me to go right in. I walked inside, and when he closed the door, I was left in a sudden and intense darkness. The lights came on slowly, still leaving me in the semi-darkness, and then I realized that it wasn't the lights I was seeing, but screens. The wall was made of screens, big ones and little ones, and they all began showing the same video, though a few of them were out of sync. I have to believe this was on purpose because the nature of the video led me to believe that it was supposed to be disorienting. It was a man with a very smooth, very cultured voice telling me about the history of art in food. There is a cycle that must be acknowledged. A man creates art and a meal. A man feeds his family, but sometimes neglects to feed the soul. A man might eat until he's ready to burst, but unless his soul is fed, he will never truly be satisfied. The dance between stomach and soul is one as old as time, and it is your great privilege tonight to be full in both ways. The TVs began to go off slowly as they led to the door, as if they were trying to lead me towards something. As I moved to keep up with them, they began going off behind me, creating a pathway towards what I assumed was the restaurant. Art imitates life, but food is life. Thus art must imitate food sometimes. Tell me, patron, do you feel fulfilled? Do you feel whole? If not, then step forward and see yourself fulfilled in ways you have never thought before. When you come to EXO, you truly come back to the womb and are reborn and fulfilled. Let us take you into your deepest desires, your darkest nightmares, and let us feed your soul as it has never been fed. I could see a door at the end of the line of television screens, and as he finished, the door opened, showing me an almost blinding light. I had to put a hand up. It was like coming to the edge of a universe and seeing what had started it all. Welcome to EXO. I stepped through the door, and on the other side was a lounge. It wasn't a particularly normal-looking lounge, no trendy New York bar, but it was full of equally well-dressed people who sat around and talked as they sipped cocktails and ate entrees. It looked to be upper class, the clientele just oozing money. But as I approached the bar, the bartender turned around and put a drink down in front of me. I hadn't asked for one, so it put me on my guard. What's this? It's our signature drink. We call it nostalgia. Go on, have a sip. It tastes different for everyone. I tried not to roll my eyes at him. It was likely just whatever was in the well mixed with whatever was on sale. All of these little pop-up places had a signature cocktail or a signature drink or something they were known for. Most of the time, it was just something they cobbled together. But as I lifted it to my nose, I found myself remembering something that I hadn't thought of in a long time. It was the smell of cut grass. And I remembered sitting on my grandmother's lawn when I was little, maybe 2 or 3. And as I banged some toys together in a game that only I understood, my grandfather drove around on his riding lawnmower and cut the grass. He would wave at me sometimes as he went past, but he was always careful not to get close enough to kick sticks or grass clippings on me. I could hear the lawnmower. I could smell the breeze. I could taste the mild flavor of dirt in the air. And above all, I could smell freshly cut grass as the mower passed less than 20 feet from me. I opened my eyes and found that I had drunk the whole thing. I'm not usually one for guzzling my drinks, but I'd finished the whole glass in what had to be a few seconds. Good, isn't it? If I might ask, what did you feel? I had intended to tell him it was none of his business. I'd meant to tell him that was private, but I found myself telling him that I'd smelled freshly cut grass before I could stop myself. He laughed. Yeah, it's usually something like that. Nostalgia usually takes you back to some point in your childhood. It reminds you of a simpler time. It gets your palate in the mood for the upcoming meal. Would you like another? I have all kinds of memories on tap. I'll tell you what, you look like a solitary man to me. He turned around and began mixing something, and when I asked him what solitary was, he turned around and handed me a chilled glass of something that looked like chocolate ice cream with just a hint of mud. Just take a sip. You'll find out. I took a sip, and I had been right. It was sweet, but also bitter. It had to be made of some kind of dark chocolate, and it was more like a milkshake than a drink. I opened my eyes, and I was in my childhood bedroom. I couldn't have been more than 16 or 17, and I was listening to something on my stereo. It was the kind of music that my parents didn't approve of, but they weren't home. It was just me. And the solitude wasn't sad or depressing. It was the kind of solitude where you're glad to just exist by yourself. It was revitalizing. It was so soothing. And I found that I wished I could go on there forever. It was over far too soon. Someone was shaking me by my shoulder as I set my glass down. Sir, your table is ready." I set the glass down and looked at the bartender. The man winked at me and told me if I wanted another for the road, he'd be happy to mix it. I told him I was okay, and I followed the waiter to my table. We left the lounge and entered another area, a dark room with a single table in it. The table was especially odd because it was under a larger dome, a big metal one, with corrugated triangles worked into the outside. At the center of each triangle was an unbroken circle, and it was suspended over the table by something I couldn't see. Whether it was a line or whether it just floated there, it hung over it like an omen. On the table was a second, smaller dome, a serving dish, covered by a lid. I sat down as the waiter pulled my chair out for me, and as I looked for a menu, I noticed he was leaving. Hey, I haven't ordered anything yet." "That will not be necessary. Your meal is already prepared." "Well, what if I'm allergic to—" "You aren't. The meal is exactly what your mind needs. It's exactly what your soul requires. Dig in, and you may leave when you're done." He left through the door I'd come in through, and I turned back to the serving tray with real dread building inside me. What the hell was under there? It couldn't be anything good. This had to be a joke. I hadn't made an order, so how would the waitstaff know what I wanted? How was I supposed to write a review on something that I hadn't even ordered? I reached out with a shaky hand and pulled the cover off the tray, and it gonged onto the table as it slipped out of my fingers. On the tray was a bit of rice and a thick red gravy. At least I hoped it was gravy. Within the rice were vegetables, asparagus, potatoes, carrots, and such. But it was what lay in the center of the rice that threatened to make me hyperventilate. Lying there was a lamb who was slowly bleeding to death. Its throat had been cut. Its eyes were still open, and its little body was aspirating as it worked out its final moments of life. I backed up a little bit from the table. I knew that lamb. It had been my lamb when I was very young. I'd gone to my uncle's house when I was very little, maybe 5 or 6. He'd owned a ranch, or maybe it was just a farm, but he had sheep and chickens and cows and such there. A lamb had recently been born, and he told me it was my responsibility to take care of it. I assumed he was hoping to instill some kind of sense of responsibility in me, but my childish mind thought the lamb was a pet. Its mother had been taken away, something I also didn't question, and it was my job to bottle feed it, to make sure it got its exercise, and to look after it when I wasn't doing other things. I loved that lamb for 2.5 months. I named it Nestor, and we would play out in the field and sometimes nap together in my uncle's orchard. He was my best friend, since there was no one else there for me to play with. But one afternoon, my uncle came to me and told me that tomorrow we were taking Nestor to the livestock auction. "He's big enough to sell, and you've done a great job of getting him big enough. I think he'll fetch a good price." I started crying. I thought this was my pet, something I would take with me when I left, and I asked my uncle what would happen to him if they sold him at the auction. My uncle was a blunt guy, and he told me what would happen to him in no uncertain terms. He'll likely be killed and eaten. People pay top dollar for lamb, and it's something of a delicacy. Your lamb will probably be on someone's plate in a couple of weeks. You should feel very proud. I'm not sure that I could have raised that lamb any better. I begged my uncle not to sell him. I made such a fuss that he actually ended up leaving me behind the next day when he took Nestor to the auction. He told me when he got back, looking into my tear-streaked face, that I needed to toughen up a little bit and prepare myself for life. I wasn't going to be a little kid forever, and I needed to understand that some animals were friends and some animals were food. I remember crying for no apparent reason a lot after that. I would just start weeping as I imagined my lamb being killed and eaten by someone who didn't even know him. I still think about it sometimes. I still sometimes think about that summer with Nestor and tear up a little for no reason that I can fathom. He would have been long dead by now anyway, and he was just a lamb. But he'd been my lamb. He'd been my friend, and it wasn't fair to do that to a child. I started hyperventilating a little, my breath coming in jagged bursts. And when the lamb turned his head to look at me, I was horrified to realize it intended to speak. It wasn't your fault. You didn't know what he intended for me. You've carried me with you for so many years. You need to let me go. None of it was your fault. You were a child who trusted adults implicitly. Do not feel sad for me. I am beyond pain now. Put me out of your mind. Stop jabbing yourself with my memory. Then it turned its head to the side and was still. Tears were running down my face, but something else was there as well. I couldn't explain it. I'd never be able to explain it in a million years. But in that moment, I was just so goddamn hungry that I could feel the drool coming down my face as heavily as my tears. I picked up my fork and suddenly I was eating. The lamb came apart as if it had been nothing but birthday cake, and I found it to be delicious. I ate the rice, I ate the vegetables, I ate the gravy or the blood or whatever it was, and I ate the lamb as if it were the last meal I was likely to have. I ate and ate and ate until there was nothing left. And then I put my head down on the table, and I wept like a baby. I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't guilty over the fate of that lamb. I felt relieved and empty, in a way I hadn't in a long time. That lamb was ultimately what had brought me to food. As little as I liked it, if animals were going to be prepared, then they might as well be prepared right. Their sacrifice wasn't to be wasted, and they deserved better than to be burnt or the meat wasted. I'd never really thought about it, but as it occurred to me like that, I felt myself stand up, wipe my mouth, and walk out of the restaurant. There was a door in the opposite direction of the one I'd come in through, and as I stepped out onto the street, I wiped my eyes and felt lighter than I had in years. The review I wrote was not the one I intended to write. I'd intended to write a very snarky review about bougie and overblown restaurants. But instead, I wrote something a little more personal. XO is not your typical chain restaurant. It's not your typical fancy restaurant. It's not a casual dining experience. It will change your life, and not necessarily for the better. Be prepared to have a long look at yourself and your choices before you sit down to dinner at XO. My editor liked it, even though I didn't go into a description of the food. People ask me if I'd eat there again, and I always tell them that even though I enjoyed the food, I would not. Some experiences you can only have once. Some experiences should only be had once. Rick wasn't one to call people in the middle of the night for no reason. He wasn't one to call me for a drink or to drop a line after 10 o'clock just to catch up. Ricky was a very straight-laced and work-minded individual. So when my phone rang at 1:35 in the morning, I knew something had to be wrong. Rick, what's going on? Is everything okay? I'm in trouble. I need you to come down to the police station right away. I turned over in bed and wiped a hand across my face. I've been a lawyer for about 3 years now, about the same amount of time Rick has been on the force. And from what I remember, the police force had in-house people for this kind of thing. They had representatives who handled cop cases, people with years more experience than I had. So if Ricky needed me to represent him, then something pretty bad must have happened. Usually the union guys will take anything, but if it's something so bad that they would wash their hands of it, then I wasn't sure I wanted to touch it either. Rick, what happened? Rick was silent for a few seconds, and when he finally spoke, I sort of wished he hadn't. There was a weight to his voice that made me think he might have accidentally killed a kid or something, but it turned out to be much worse than that. I don't want to talk about it on the phone. Will you come down to the precinct? I reluctantly told him I would, and an hour later I was sitting in one of the interrogation rooms across from him. Rick didn't look like he usually did. Rick was always very well put together, a funny guy, someone who always had a joke ready to go. The Rick that sat across from me looked like he had aged 10 years. His eyes looked haunted, his hands were shaking hard enough to make the cuffs on his wrist jingle, and when he looked at me, he seemed to see right through me. All right, Rick, I'm here. What's all this about? He was quiet for a minute, the same way he had been on the phone, and I'd almost decided that he was wasting my time before he started talking. I killed a cop. The words hit me like a bag of concrete dropped off the top floor. He had killed a cop. Why would Rick kill a cop? Rick was a cop, for starters, and he'd always had a very deep respect for law enforcement. When he was a kid, all he had ever talked about was being a police officer, like his dad. When he had joined the police academy, it had been the happiest day of his life. Ricky was legitimately excited to get up and go to work every day, and the idea that he would have shot a fellow officer was baffling. Not just any cop, he went on. I shot my partner. I'd met Ricky's partner a couple of times. Officer Dillon was a nice guy, a little stoic, but really a nice guy. He and Rick played well off each other. Rick was always the good cop, and Dillon was always the quiet, sort of mean cop. They had been partnered together for a couple of years now, and they were one of the few academy partnerships that had lasted the test of time. Okay, why would you do that? He attacked me, Rick said, as he reached up and pulled back his sleeve to show me bruises on his arm. He leaned his head back, and I could see bruises on his neck, too. I felt like I should have noticed them from the start. Someone had really worked him over, and I wondered why Officer Dillon, someone who was almost as good a friend to him as I was, would have done such a thing. It was more than that, though. I didn't just kill him because he hurt me. I killed him because of what had been done to him, because of what would have been done if he'd been allowed to go on. I tapped my pencil on the desk, not liking what I was hearing. Rick sounded mad as I had her. Ricky, you are making a lot of sense. Tell me what happened. I need to know what happened so I can put up some kind of fight for you. Rick nodded, staring more at the back of his hands than at me. I'll tell you, but it's not going to make a lot of sense. I'm not even sure that I understand it. Just start from the beginning, I told him. We'll see what we can do about it. Rick still wouldn't look up from his hands, but he started telling it to me like toilet paper rolling off a spool. Case number 469876, Exhibit A, Officer Rick Page, 2/13/2025. Okay, Officer Page, tell me what happened. We got called to a breaking and entering on Gulf Court. It was pretty typical, but the dispatcher said the woman who had called was older, and you know how Dylan felt about that. He put on the lights and sirens, and we called in that we were close so we would pick it up. We came in and headed up to the 3rd floor, our hands already on our guns. Inside, you could hear someone yelling and a lot of things breaking. Neighbors were sticking their heads out into the hallway, and we told them to get back behind their doors so we could do our job. Okay. Did you identify yourself before entry? We banged on the door and told them we were police and that they needed to come out. Did they respond? No. The scuffling didn't really stop, but it did change a little. The woman was still screaming for help, but that was when I noticed that her home invader wasn't saying much of anything. He was making these weird grunting noises, this half-scream noise. And when no one was coming to open the door, Dylan told me to step aside, and he booted it open. There was a minute, like an instant, just before he kicked it open, where I heard a sound that was difficult to describe. Sounded like someone being sick, but it also sounded like someone trying to throw up something heavy and only partially digested. I started to tell Dylan to hang on a minute, but the door splintered open as he put his boot against it, and we came in with our guns drawn, ready for anything. Well, we thought we were ready for anything. What did you find? When you become a cop, you do this weird thing anytime you go into a room. You immediately assess your surroundings and take in all the details in a split second. I've heard other law enforcement guys talk about it. It's something I don't think a lot of them are aware of. When the door came open, I saw a broken window. I saw the glass on the ground right in front of it. I saw a cell phone lying amid the glass as if it had been knocked out of somebody's hand. I saw a TV that was playing The Late Show, but the volume was off, and the host was just sort of talking with his hands on the screen. I took all that in, and then I saw the man who was straddling the old lady on the ground. She was trying to fight him off, but she didn't seem to be having any luck. He was holding her down, and their faces were about an inch or two apart from each other. That's when I realized the weird noise was coming from him. It was like he was trying to throw up on her, and I heard Dylan yell at him to get off of her as he pointed his gun upward so that he could get a clean shot. As something came out of his mouth, the old lady turned her head, and it sent the guy flailing sideways towards my partner. Dylan shot him, probably thinking he had intended to lunge at him. He hit him twice, right in the center mass, and the guy fell down. I realized whatever he was trying to throw up had come up about 3 inches away from the woman. It looked like a half-formed potato, the kind of thing you might see a kid hang over a bowl of water for his science fair project. But then it got up on its little half-formed legs and began running at my partner. I pulled my gun up to cover him, but Dylan put an arm out as if trying to stop me. "Settle down, partner. I've got him," he said. "Call it in so we can..." But he never got to finish. Whatever the thing was, it jumped onto his face, and before he could get a hand up to fight it off, it had crawled into his mouth as he screamed in surprise. It shouldn't have been able to get down his throat like that, but I heard his scream cut off and watched his throat bulge as the little monster wormed its way into his windpipe. He clutched his throat and tried to bring it up, but as it cleared his throat and fell into his stomach, he gasped and bent over double as he breathed in hard. He didn't look right. He was making these uncomfortable-looking heaves. What did you do then? I put a hand on his shoulder, and I asked him if he was okay. When he slapped it away, I jerked back in surprise. He lifted his head, and his eyes didn't look right. The veins were all bugged out, and the corneas had turned black and looked way too big. He was still gasping, still trying to rip out his own throat, but after a few seconds, his hands fell down, and he looked at me like he wasn't sure what he was seeing. I called his name. I asked him if he was okay, but then he lunged at me, and as his hands went around my throat, I didn't know what to make of it. I pushed him off, asking what was wrong, but he came at me again. He just kept trying to get his hands around my throat, and I could hear him making those weird gagging noises that the other guy was making before he came in. I don't know what he was doing, and I don't know what he intended to do once he got a hold of me. But after the third time I threw him off, I pointed my gun at him and told him to stay down. I didn't want to shoot him. It was the last thing in the world I wanted to do. But when he got up that fourth time, I didn't have a lot of choice. I put one in his leg, something we were told never to do. But it didn't slow him down in the least bit. I put one in his hip then. I just wanted to slow him down or make him stop. But he flinched a little and just kept coming after me. He was crazy. His eyes were completely black, and there was this thick substance trailing out of the corners of his mouth. It was sliding down his chin like drool, but it was way too thick to be drool. When he came at me again, I put a third round right in his chest, and that dropped him pretty quickly. I lifted my radio to call it in, already shaking, but that was when the creature came back again. I saw it crawl out of Dylan's mouth, just come burrowing out like a mole. And when it saw me, it made a weird, high-pitched noise and came at me on the run. I shot it twice. I know I shot it twice. But after the second shot, it lunged to the left and just went out the window. I don't know what it was, and I don't know where it went. But I was glad it was gone. After that, I just stayed there until backup arrived. I got on my radio and called it in. I told them we had an officer down and that my weapon had been involved. And when they got there, they listened to me. Then they put me in the back of a squad car. They checked my camera footage, but I guess my camera had been damaged at some point. None of the footage was usable, and the camera was pretty well slagged. They put my partner in a body bag and transported him to County General. They put me in the back of the car and took me here, and I've been here ever since. As he finished, he gave me a look of such desperation and pleading that I had to believe he was telling me the truth. I've known Rick for a long time, and he was a lot of things, but a cop killer and a liar wasn't one of them. His story was hard to believe, especially the little monster that the man had thrown up and that had taken over his partner, but I found that I still believed him. You got to get me out of here. I'm no cop killer. I wouldn't have shot Dylan for anything, but after the third time he attacked me, I felt how deep his fingers were around my neck. I knew it was him or me, and I wanted to live. Can you help me? Will you help me? I told him that I would, but I didn't know how much I was going to be able to help without body cam footage or anything. It was his word against a dead cop, and that usually doesn't end well. Luckily, someone's body cam was working. They managed to pull the video from his partner's body cam, and it went a long way in proving his story. We didn't find any little potato monster, but what we did find was Officer Corey Dillon thrashing around and then beginning to attack his partner. I showed it in the courtroom, letting everyone see how Ricky had tried to put his friend off 3 times before he had finally been forced to shoot him. We got pictures of the bruises around his neck, and the lady they had saved actually corroborated some of the story. She had seen a little bit of it before she passed out, and she told them that Dylan had tried to attack his partner for some reason. Rick was politely asked to retire after that, and he agreed on the condition that he could take an early retirement. I don't hear a lot from Rick anymore. He was thankful for my assistance, but he goes out a lot now, and I think he might be looking for whatever that creature was that crawled out of his partner. Somehow or another, he's decided that that creature is his responsibility, and he's going to find it before it hurts anybody else. I wish him luck, but what chance do you really have with something that can crawl inside of people and control them like that? The deal really was too good to be true. It was a late 70s Firebird with less than 500 miles on it. It had custom wheels, and the interior looked like it had just been fully cleaned and serviced. It even still had the original floor mats, and as I sat there in the woman's driveway and looked at it, I felt sure that it either wouldn't crank or it would need a lot of work. "You must be Sam," the woman said as she came down the steps to her home. I turned, jumping a little as the screen door slammed. "You must be Miss Lindor. Thanks for letting me see the car. The deal was so good that I just knew I had to jump on it." Miss Lindor was not the woman I had expected. Not exactly. I had expected a much older woman, but Miss Lindor looked as if she might be younger than my own mother. She had the keys on one finger, twirling them slowly as if asking me if I wanted to go for a ride. But what really caught my attention was her eyes when she looked at me. She seemed to be trying to assess me, as if trying to figure out whether I could afford the car. That's what I thought at first, but the longer she looked at me, the more I thought it might have been something different. She was looking at me as if she thought I might be unworthy, or maybe whether she could sell a car to someone like me. In retrospect, given what I found out about it, I think she was weighing whether or not her soul could take selling me a car like this. She tossed me the keys, and when I cranked the engine, I heard how smooth it was, and it created more questions than answers. "How much did you say you wanted for it?" I asked, thinking the price must have been a mistake. "If you have $5,000 cash, then it can be yours right now. I don't have any need for it. It was my husband's car." The way she said husband made me think there might be more to it than that. Maybe ex-husband or recently separated husband might have been a better title, but I put it out of my mind as I ran a hand along the pollen-smeared exterior of the car. "What's wrong with it?" I finally asked, feeling it was time to get to the blunt end of the deal. Nobody sold a car like this for anything less than 5 figures, and I just knew that there had to be something going on beneath the hood. It had transmission issues. There was a problem with the suspension. It needed several alignments to get back into something that you could drive on the road. Something like that. Nobody sells a car that cheap if it's in good shape. And I was becoming more and more suspicious the longer we talked. She looked embarrassed, and I again suspected that she might be selling this car without her husband's permission. It was an ex-husband who had been taking advantage of her and maybe had taken everything except the car, and now she was trying to recoup some small amount of revenge. It was a boyfriend's car who had done her wrong, and now she wanted to make him suffer by selling his baby. Maybe it wasn't that. Maybe it was her dad's car and he had recently died and she just couldn't stand to look at it. Whatever the case, I just knew there had to be some history here. "Well, it was my husband's car. He died recently, very recently, and he died in the car. I've tried to drive it since, but every time I look at it or think about getting behind the wheel, I get a stab of panic and I just can't bring myself to do it. It's been sitting in my driveway for months while I try to muster up the courage to drive it again, but I don't think I ever will. I'd rather get a little money for it and find someone who will actually drive it, rather than let it sit here and rust all to pieces. You seem like a nice kid, and a nice boy like you needs a nice car. Take it for a test drive, and if you aren't completely sold on it, then I will absolutely understand." I thought about it for about half a second and then climbed into the driver's seat before looking over at the passenger seat. I'd expected her to climb in, expected her to ride along with me, but when I looked, she was still on the sidewalk and shaking her head at me. Just don't be gone long. Take it around the block and let me know what you think. If you want it, it's yours for $5,000. When I got behind the wheel, the car just felt right. It was like I'd been born to drive it. And when I pulled out of the driveway and turned towards the end of the street, I was already pretty sure I was going to buy it. The interior smelled like soap. The floor mats squeaked a little when my feet moved across them, and the whole thing looked ready for the showroom. I couldn't believe she was selling it so cheaply, but as I pulled up to the stop sign, checking my mirrors, something caught my eye for the briefest of seconds, and it made me jump a little. It was something I could have probably pushed off on the sun, or maybe the tinting on the back window, but it seemed like someone was sitting in the seat behind me. They were leaning against the door, hands folded in their lap, and the smile on his face was almost cartoonishly big. It was a man, his greasy hair hanging over his eyes, and as he glared at me in the rearview mirror, I felt a jolt in my stomach. I put on the brakes and turned around, looking in the back seat as if expecting to find someone waiting there. But I found nothing. The back seat was empty, not even any dust or change in the floorboards. I turned back around as someone beeped at me and took a right at the stop sign as I drove down the road. I went around the block and then came back to Miss Lindor's house, reaching into my pocket already as I held out the money. "If you've got the title, I'll sign it and pay you right now." Other than the weird incident in the back seat, I loved the car, and I would have paid 2 or 3 times as much for it. She rushed inside and got the title, signing it right there on the hood of the car. Thinking back on it, she was way too eager to get rid of it. But I didn't notice at the time. I was too busy laughing internally about the good deal I had gotten, about how good I was going to look behind the wheel of my brand new car. Some of that excitement wore off on the way home when I went to check my mirrors and saw the same grinning face looking at me in the mirror. He was sitting in the same spot, his legs crossed and his hands in his lap. But when I turned around, there was still nothing there. I shook my head as I spun back to face front, thinking it had been a reflection or a trick of the light or something. It was a new car. I was just seeing weird shadows or seeing something in the rearview mirror that wasn't there. It was an optical illusion. Something, but the longer I drove the car, the more I began to notice it. It was always the same. That smiling man sitting in the back seat, glaring at me with his eyes and smiling into the mirror. The longer I owned the car, the worse it got. I began to become aware of a smell that would follow the appearance of the man. It was a strangely musty smell, the kind of smell your jacket gets when you put it away wet. It wasn't too bad in the daylight, but if I were driving at night, it would get even worse. I'd put music on. Sometimes I'd even put my headphones in, but I could hear the stranger humming from the back seat whenever I drove it at night. It was Beethoven's Fifth, hummed at an oddly gravelly voice. It would fall on me like rain in October, and it was almost like it was creeping over my skin, like fingers, the longer it went on. After a while, it started to say my name. Sam, Sam, Sam. Over and over and over again. It would start out low and rumbling, something that could have been anything, but by the end it would be practically yelling at me as I drove to wherever I was going. Sam, Sam, Sam. Some nights it was all I could do to deal with it long enough to get home. One night, I suppose it kind of saved my life, but it was far from something I was grateful for, especially after the scare it gave me. I was driving home after drinking with some friends. maybe a little bit drunk, but not bad enough to affect my driving. I was doing a little bit of nodding. It was late, I was tired, but when the voice came from the back seat, it almost seemed to be lulling me to sleep. It was whispering my name, slower and slower, and as I listened to it over whatever podcast I had put on to keep me awake, my eyes got heavier and heavier. I was losing seconds a little at a time when I finally closed my eyes and began to snore. The whispering seemed to be over. Sam! I shook myself awake, coming in to find that I'd almost run a red light. The truck that had been coming from the other direction would have nailed me, but whatever was in the car had stopped me from being in a really bad accident. I looked in the rearview mirror as I slammed on the brakes, expecting to see him there, but the back seat was empty. I could still smell that musty smell of him, though, and it was almost as if I could hear his words echoing in my head. That was when I realized I had to do something. That was when I realized I needed to talk to Miss Lindor. Miss Lindor was out in her garden when I drove up. She turned her head and almost seemed deflated when she saw the vehicle. It was as if she had been waiting for me to bring it back and had only been living on borrowed happiness while it was away. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw her dust off her hands and look at me hopelessly. "Oh, good afternoon, Sam. Did you need something? I think I have another copy of the title if it slipped through your hands." I told her I didn't need a title. I needed to know what had happened to her car and, more importantly, her ex-husband. "Well, that's a little personal, don't you think?" she said, but she didn't look sure. "Under any other circumstances, I'd agree with you, ma'am, but not considering what's living in the back of my car." She'd opened her mouth, clearly ready to fire back with something, but when the words fell over her, she seemed to deflate even more. "Come inside. I'll give you a piece of pound cake and some coffee, and I'll tell you the whole sad story." I wanted to tell her that we could talk right here on the front porch, but as mad as I was, pound cake was still pound cake, and a cup of coffee would be pretty nice right about now. She brought me in and fixed my coffee just the way I liked it and put a big piece of lemon pound cake down on the table in front of me. She took off her dirt-stained apron and put on a different one, her kitchen apron, I suppose, and then sat across from me as she lit a cigarette and took a long drag before beginning. "Marvin and I were married for 35 years. That didn't mean we were happy, and I'd be one of the people that would agree that our marriage was 35 years too long. Marvin was, well, he was a terrible man. He liked to drink, he liked to fight, and sometimes he brought his favorite things home with him to share with me. I've had to tell people that I've run into quite a few doorknobs and slipped down quite a few flights of stairs in the 35 years I was married to him. It wasn't until he retired that I figured out about some of his less healthy hobbies. Marvin had been a long-haul trucker, so he was only home every few weeks. Apparently, he'd been getting up to some less than savory things while he'd been on the road. Marv had a particular liking for young women, and I don't mean college co-eds. I'd seen the way he looked at them, but it wasn't until he tried to bring one home that I put my foot down. That was a beating I'll never forget. I thought he was going to kill me, and when he was done, he stood over me and told me not to get involved in his business ever again. I was afraid for a little while, but once I started noticing the way he looked at the younger girls in the neighborhood, I got over my fear real quick. She thumbed some of her ash into the little ashtray on the corner of the table before continuing. The only thing Marv loved more than fighting and drinking was his car. He only drove it when he had to, and he would take it into the driveway and wash it whenever he was home. He would cruise in it sometimes when he was trying to pick up victims, or so I was told. He was in it when I caught him, so that makes sense. I was supposed to be at the market, but it had gotten a little bit late that day. One of my neighbors had asked to borrow the car, and it was so late in the afternoon that I let her do it. She had needed to take her daughter to the doctor, and her car had just quit on her. It was too late to go to the market anyway. Marv would be home in a couple of hours, and he would want his dinner. So I told her to just bring it back with gas in it. I just started making dinner when I heard him pull his car into the driveway and then into the garage. I wondered why he was home so early, and when I went to the garage, I saw him sitting in the car with a girl that I didn't know. God only knows what he told her to get her there, but none of it mattered much to me. He was touching her, just brushing her clothes and running her fingers through her hair, but the girl was pressed against the door of his car in a very familiar way. She was terrified of him. Suddenly I knew I had to do something. I went out to the car and startled him, popping him in the head with a wrench before he could do more than let his hands roam a little. I told the girl to get out of there, told her to not to tell anybody, and to just go. I suppose she did just that. Marv was out cold, but I hadn't hit him hard enough to draw blood. I thought about it for a moment, and, well, finally I did what I'd seen done in 100 movies and TV shows. I hooked the silver hose from the dryer to the tailpipe. I put the other end in the car window and rolled the window up nearly all the way. I closed up the garage and went back to cooking dinner. Then, about an hour later, I went out to the garage and discovered, oh no, my poor husband had committed suicide in the car that he loved so much. The police didn't question it. It had been a suicide after all, and after what they discovered from some concerned citizens, most of them thought he'd probably killed himself out of guilt over what he'd been doing to the teenage girls in the neighborhood. Nobody questioned me too harshly, and life went on. Apparently, life went on for Marv as well. She saw that I'd finished my pound cake and went to go get me another piece before being asked. I didn't want another piece. The story was making me a little sick to my stomach, but I ate it. The story might have been terrible, but the pound cake was really tasty. It was subtle at first. I would be driving the car, and I'd see him in the rearview mirror. He would just be sitting back there, grinning at me. At first I thought it was my guilt, but then he began to say my name. He began to tell me that the cops would catch up to me eventually, and that's when I stopped driving the car altogether. I tried to sell it, of course I did, but you weren't the first person to come back with questions. Eventually, I dropped the price as much as I dared, and still, people brought it back. I've saged the car. I've had a priest bless it, but nothing helps. I suppose you'll want your money back. Can't even blame you for it. I did you dirty, and I'm sorry for that. I just wanted to be rid of this car so badly that I was willing to do almost anything. She put my money on the table, the same collection of bills that I'd handed to her a few weeks ago. I picked it up, but before I could pocket it, she put another $100 on the table. "What's that for?" I asked. "I need your help with something." "And what might that be?" I asked, not touching the money. "I know what I have to do now. There's no way I'm ever going to be able to get him out of the car. I've tried everything I know of, and there seems to be only one other option. He loved that car, more than he ever loved anything else, and it seems like the best thing I can do is to send it to him, in whatever corner of hell he now resides in." I agreed to help her, and she seemed glad for the company. I followed her to the old quarry, and we found a rock big enough to jam onto the pedal of the old Firebird. I got it up to speed and bailed out before it went over the edge, and as it fell, I thought I could see that grinning specter behind the wheel. He was grinning ear to ear, fit to split, my grandmother would have said, and when it hit the ground in a wave of flames and metal, I opened the passenger side door to my car and took her home. I suppose when a deal is just too good to be true, you have to see it through